Going over all the components for this installation, starting at the top left of the board, we have the rear axle shaft key. This key will be installed in the slot on the axle shaft where my finger points and the slot on the wheel hub where my finger points. Moving down the part board, we have our rear axle shaft washer. This washer will be installed on top of the wheel hub, but make sure we install our axle shaft key into that slot on our axle shaft and through the axle wheel hub slot as well. And on top of our washer, we will have our rear axle shaft nut. This will thread directly onto our axle shaft threads, and then we will install a cotter pin through the hole on the axle shaft, but this will have to be torqued to a minimum of 150 foot-pounds. And then once we get the cotter pin installed, the dust cover will be installed on top. Lastly, going over the components we're going to need in this installation, we're going to need a hammer and a punch. The punch will allow us to drive our axle shaft key into the slot on our wheel hub and through the slot on our axle shaft. We're also going to need some acetone just to clean up our wheel hub before we apply our multi-purpose grease. The wheel hub has already been pressed on to our brake drum using the wheel studs. It has to be done prior to this install, and the brake drum then will be installed onto our brake assembly and onto our axle shaft. The first step is to use some acetone to clean up our axle wheel hub before we apply grease. With the wheel hub now clean, we can now apply some high temperature wheel bearing grease. The purpose of putting grease on the wheel hub will allow the oil seal inside the axle where my finger points to glide better on your wheel hub. Next, apply some wheel bearing grease to the outside of the axle shaft. With grease applied to all surfaces, now we can install the brake drum and hub assembly onto the rear axle shaft. Just slide it on. Taking a closer look, you can see the slot on the axle shaft and the slot on the hub are not in line. Just have to spin it so they are in line. The axle shaft slot and the slot on the wheel hub are now in line. Now it's time to install the axle shaft key. You can see this key does have a tapered end to it. This taper end has to be facing downwards and pointing inwards towards your hub. As you can see, it is orientated this direction. Now we will just have to slide it into the slot on the axle shaft and the slot on the wheel hub. Please note if you do not install the axle shaft key in the right direction with the taper pointing downwards and towards the hub, you can split and crack your hub. The next step is to drive the axle shaft key into the slot on the axle shaft and the slot on the wheel hub. Just use a hammer and we'll lightly tap in our axle shaft key. Now use a punch so you can drive the axle shaft key all the way into the axle shaft slot. Taking a closer look, I drive the axle shaft key until it is flush with the wheel hub. Now we have to install the washer. Next, install the axle shaft washer, just sliding it onto your axle shaft. The last step is to install the axle shaft nut. Install it with the crown facing outwards and just thread it onto your axle shaft. Now with the rear axle shaft washer and nut installed onto our rear axle shaft, we have to now install the tire back onto our wheel hub. This will allow us to torque this nut to a minimum of 150 foot-pounds. Before the rear axle shaft nut can be torqued to a minimum of 150 foot-pounds, make sure to reinstall the tire onto your wheel hub. The next step is to remove the rear axle shaft nut, just so we can mark the holes on the axle shaft. Use a Sharpie to mark the hole that's on the axle shaft, so we kind of have an idea where to put the cotter pin. Make sure the rear axle shaft washer is installed before the nut is rethreaded back on. We'll rethread the nut back onto the axle shaft. Now it's time to torque the rear axle shaft nut using a large torque wrench. This has a 1.7/16" socket. We're going to use a 6-point because this will be torqued to a minimum of 150 foot-pounds. The rear axle shaft nut has now been torqued to 150 foot-pounds, and you can see the marks that we made on our axle shaft is in line with the slots under a crown nut. We know that the cotter pin will slide right through the crown nut, right to the axle shaft, and come out the other side so we can bend it. And if these marks are not in line with the slots on your crown nut, just torque this nut more than 150 foot-pounds, never go less. The nut is now torqued more, and the cotter pin now will slide right through the hole on the axle shaft, right through the crown nut. With your cotter pin fully seated into your axle shaft, now we have to bend up both sides like any other cotter pin. Just bend it up And then we'll bend this one back, and then we'll use a pair of snips just to cut the cotter pin so it doesn't stick above your nut and it actually sits flat on the bottom. Use a flathead screwdriver and a hammer just to hit up the bottom part of the cotter pin so it seats flat against the nut. The final step is to install the dust cover over your wheel hub. Just push it on, it goes over your cotter pin and your nut. And that is how you install the wheel hub and brake drum onto your 1947 CJ8 Willys Jeep.
Thanks for watching and subscribe.